Good evening, everybody. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. Whether you're watching on Crowdcast, Facebook Live, or Facebook Live, we're glad that you could join us this evening. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women's political empowerment. So as we kick off Women's History Month, and of course approach International Women's Day next Monday, we wanted to bring you the story of a group of young Kurdish women in northern Syria who had a vision for a truly egalitarian society that they were willing to fight and die for. So our guest tonight, Gayle Tzemach Lemmon, tells their incredible story. She traveled to Syria 7 times, conducted hundreds of interviews, and has just published The Daughters of Kobani, a story of rebellion, courage, and justice, which is already a New York Times bestseller and will be made into a film. So we will eagerly anticipate that. This is Gayle's 3rd best-selling book, all 3 of which are about remarkable and courageous women. She has a long career in journalism, finance, and public policy, and is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And we are delighted that she is here with us this evening. I want to let everybody know that we're going to save some time for questions. So at the bottom of your screen, you will notice the Ask the Question button. So please feel free to ask a question there. We'll get to as many as we can, and you'll be able to upvote other people's questions that you're interested in. And at the conclusion of the event, if you would like to share it or replay it, you'll be able to do so at the link that you used to sign up for. So Gayle, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm a big admirer of your newsletter and of what the Institute does.
Oh, thank you, Gayle. So I wanted to start off by playing a brief video for folks that gives a good overview, I think, of the book. And then we can talk about it. You'll be able to see a lot of the subjects that Gayle talks to and give you a sense of when it takes place, where it takes place, and then we will talk on the other side of that. So let me put that up here and play it for folks.
2014 was the year ISIS shook the world. In Kobani, an all-women militia emerged. They would take revenge on the men who bought and sold women and girls. It's a story about the most far-reaching experiment in women's equality. I wouldn't have believed it had I not seen it for myself, and once I did, I knew I had to tell it.
So, Gayle, you said in the film there that you would not have believed it. You had to see it for yourself. Tell us how you did see it for yourself, how you first found out about these women, and in your initial trips to Syria.
So I found out I was actually in Los Angeles and received a call via WhatsApp from one of the soldiers who was part of the second book I wrote, called Ashley's War, about an all-women special operations team that had been recruited for Army Ranger and Navy SEAL missions in 2011 while women remained banned from ground combat. And she had by then joined a special operations team in a different capacity and was in Syria and called me and said, you have to come here. You have to come to Syria because there are women leading in battle. And they're not just leading women in battle, they're leading men from their community in the fight against ISIS. And they have respect both from the men in their community and the very elite tested fighters of U.S. special operations who have really lived the post 9/11 conflicts ceaselessly and have enormous respect for these women. And then she went on to say, it's not just that they're fighting ISIS, it's that they're also fighting for women's equality. I mean, and I heard that and I thought,
wow.
Yeah, exactly. How can you not want to tell that story?
Well, I want to share just a map of the region just to explain to folks where Kobani is and what the situation in terms of ISIS in 2014, going back then, what the region looked like. And you can see Kobani here at kind of, north part of Syria, and that whole region in red there is sort of the area that was controlled or contested by ISIS.
Yes, and actually, for those of you who are interested in the map piece of this and the political piece of this, General Allen and I did the Amanpour show today, and he was talking about how in the U.S. mind, that whole part of Syria going farther than the red was black for ISIS. That is the fact that U.S. policymakers were contending with. So if we rewind a little bit, this story is so extraordinary because it is the David versus Goliath story about the women who stood up to the men who bought and sold women as a central part of who they were in a town almost nobody had heard of at a time when no one had defeated ISIS. ISIS had had not one battlefield loss and had taken this pretty glittering string of victories for months uncontested and was putting out its very slick propaganda videos, its recruiting tools serving as the flame to which extremists and those who wanted to be part of the Islamic State were coming from all around the globe. And then here comes 2014, this summer into fall of 2014, and this fighting force no one had ever heard of, which had women right at the heart of who they were and women's equality right at the core of their ideology, is resisting being one more town that falls to ISIS. And that's when the world starts to pay attention.
And tell us about some of these women, how they, the life that they grew up in and how they came together in this sense, and some of their personal stories, because you take a lot of time in the book to go through and tell a lot of personal background about these women, how they grew up, and what their, aspirations were for, the future in many ways.
I love this question because so many times we see women who rise to heroic moments as superhuman. And as much as I love Thor Ragnarok and Tessa Thompson, who I'm obsessed with, and Valkyries, they are not superhuman. These are ordinary people like the women in the communities you and I and all of you amazing people who are joining us live in North Carolina, in Georgia, in Florida. They're just like the women who when their community is threatened, when their families are threatened, when their town is threatened, they decide to put themselves on the line because it matters. So there's Azima, who's in a picture of, who is probably the person that most readers write me about. And I laugh because, I have to tell you, telling this story is such a joy and a privilege. And I spent a lot of time with Azima, who is chain-smoking, swashbuckling, high school volleyball star, who everybody has the person in their family who doesn't take no for an answer, and that's her. Right. So, she starts leading a small groups and then ever larger in the fight in Kobani. And I can't explain to you how unlikely it was that this is the first town that truly stands up and resists ISIS when it gets help from the international community, from the air. They do the fighting from the ground. Mm-hmm. Right. And she's, one of multiple children, grows up with her sister, and her sister calls her in the middle of the battle for Kobani. And she said, she's given her such a hard time. She said, listen, I told you I would call you as soon as the ISIS fight was over. We're trying to fight the Islamic State here, and her sister said, she gave me such a hard time when I called her in the middle of the battle, but at least I knew she was still alive. And she's somebody who loved to lead from the front.
The sort of humanity too. You talk, there's another story about one of the women whose mother keeps calling. And as us moms can appreciate, she knows that if she doesn't answer, the mother is going to keep calling. And then the next step is to, call her friends and ask if she's okay. And at one point, she just, instead of saying hello, she just holds out the receiver so that her mom can hear the sound of gunfire herself. That she's
right. And I wanted that to people to see that, Betsy, because it's so important to see the humanity amid the inhumanity.
Yeah.
Right? These are daughters and sisters and friends, right, who put their lives on the line so that a world in which ISIS held territory would not stand. And Rojda is another one of the women we meet who is the Americans' interlocutor in the fight to take the so-called capital back from ISIS. And she's this girl, really quiet, kind of reminded me a little bit of Beth from Little Women, for those of you who follow that. Very introverted, very quiet, not kind of the opposite of Azima, who's one of her best friends, right? Who's much more like Jo March. And she is, as a girl, plays soccer in her grandmother's village. And her uncle dresses up as a ghost because that is shameful. And he tries to scare them into not playing soccer because, girls aren't supposed to be playing football out in the open in a very traditional culture. And she goes all the way from that to defying him as a girl to really being the Americans' partner in the fight to stop ISIS from having territory from which it could launch attacks against the US, against Europe, and against the region.
And this is a photo of you doing some of these interviews. Talk to us about your reporting process and how willing these women were to speak with you, and putting yourself really in in the line of fire and danger and going over there as often as you did. Just fascinated by your experience and what you were able to see on the ground and the women that you were able to talk to.
I mean, what a privilege, right? To be able to live that history. Not a single one of the people I interviewed thought they had done anything special. And Rojda, I think, really exemplifies that. Here she was telling me stories. ISIS would get on the walkie-talkies and say, we're going to come enslave you, we're going to come kill you. And she would just brush it aside, go back to her work. And sometimes her junior people would get on the radio and say, yeah, you're such a man. And you'll see this in the book. You're such a man, show us where you are. And sometimes they actually would, which would not end well for them. But Rojda, I think is like so many of the women in this story, they did not want to talk at the beginning because they are busy fighting ISIS and doing things that are really urgent, and did not think that they were extraordinary, but they would talk to me about their friends. And I think that is so often with women. They don't want to sound like they think they did anything special, but they want to make sure how heroic their friend was. And Rojda used to joke with me, Gayle, like, when is this book going to be done? How many interviews are we going to do? Because Betsy, the thing is that book interviews are deeply tedious.
Yes.
You sit for hours. There's nothing fun or glamorous about it. You sit for hours going, where were you? Here's the picture. Show me where you were standing. What did it smell like? What did you have for breakfast? What did it feel like? Right? And they're really like, Gayle, oh my God, how many, and there's a scene at the end of the book after she's been dealing with CNN and everybody in the fight to retake Raqqa, when they say, how do you feel at the very end when ISIS is defeated, just in Raqqa? And she said, I feel great. And I'm really happy I don't have to talk to you guys anymore.
So tell us about, you mentioned the relationships that these women had with each other. And this is a picture of a Nowruz. She was one of the older women, but there is a little bit of a mentoring relationship that goes on. And you do see kind of coming full circle in many ways. Some women that started out, in 2014, by 2016 are leading, the militia themselves.
That's right. And Nowruz is the head of the Women's Protection Unit and grew up with a mother who had never had the chance to go to school. And she would come in and say, make sure your life looks different than mine. And that really stayed with her as a girl. And actually, my mother said the same thing to me, and it always stayed with me. And so we would talk about her journey, and she would go from that to ended up leading all the women's protection units in the fight in Kobani against ISIS that gets thrust onto the global stage by CNN and by the Americans who need a battlefield partner that is willing to take the fight to ISIS and also not topple the Assad regime. And for the Kurds who are part of this story, there was deep concern Now, there was no love lost for the regime. They had been tortured by the regime, jailed by the regime, but there was no guarantee that whoever came next would be better. So Nowruz is here, the Americans are paying attention. She's on the ground in Kobani, and there's a moment in the book where they're low on weapons, low on food, low on ammunition, low on people. And she says, but what we do have is ourselves and our will. And she gets on the walkie-talkie to her women commanders, Azima, Rojda, Znarine, Yumi, and she says, these men think you are worth nothing. Show them who you are and show them what you are capable of, so that if this is our last moment, it will stand for something. And to every woman I interviewed, I made them, kind of walk me through that over and over again. That speech becomes the foundation for them motivating their own forces as they go on from that battle for Kobani to lead.
Right. And yeah, it's, it's not just women as fighters, but women as leaders together. In fact, at one point, I think you were writing about Azima, and one of the male force members that she was, I guess, commanding, told her that they had heard an ISIS fighter say that a woman is leading a lot of fighters in the battle and we want to kill her. So sometimes they were actually targeted because they were women.
Absolutely. And because they were effective. And Azima had kind of this bravado where she would tell the men who were serving with her and under her command, oh, I don't care about that. But at this point, there's a moment in the book where she's been shot by ISIS. She's has a bullet in her heart that they've left. She has been grazed earlier by ISIS, and she gets out of the hospital bed in the press conference after the fight for Kobani, just to say that women have been part of delivering this victory against ISIS. And I think it's that determination and her humor, right? There's a scene at the very end of the book where at the final moment where they're having the ceremony for Baghouz and for the ISIS fight being over for now. In terms of the territory, and U.S. officials are there. It's a big policy story, and she's kind of doubled over, sneaking a cigarette in the middle of this with Rosha yelling at her, and it's that kind of friendship and love and heart that was at the center of why they fought this battle, because it wasn't for the joy of going to war. Not one of them wanted to go to war, but it was so that, as Nowruz said, if we can lead in war, no one will say we cannot govern come peace. And it was always about the political peace for them.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the U.S. role earlier. Can you explain to folks what that looked like and how maybe that evolved over time, and what were sort of the political components, of course, that seeped into some of that decision making as well?
So the ghost of the Iraq War has hung over every decision the United States has made on Syria across now 3 administrations. And I wanted the book to take readers into that, because sometimes we see Washington, as you know well from your current life and your former, as omnipotent or, having all the answers. And the truth is, it's made of people who are balancing political realities with national security imperatives, with on-the-ground truths. And that becomes what the Obama administration's reality is. It has to figure out how to stop the Islamic State without putting U.S. boots on the ground, because the Obama administration is very clear. It was elected, in its view, to end wars in the Middle East, not to start new ones. And the American public was very much aligned with that view. So it's looking for this Goldilocks, right? A fighting force that will take on ISIS and fight and die to stop the Islamic State, while also being willing to not go for regime change, which was something the Americans had no appetite for.
Right.
And so here comes this fighting force, and this becomes the real policy tightrope that the Americans start walking as they start to work with this group of Syrian Kurds who have the Women's Protection Force right at the heart of it.
And then explain the component of our NATO ally Turkey in terms of the Kurds and the different groups of Kurds and how that plays into some of that delicate situation that you were talking about.
And this is something I really want readers to kind of enter the world of, right? U.S. policymakers have this extreme challenge, and they're walking truly a policy tightrope, the likes of which we still have not yet seen, and which is as yet unresolved. Because on the one hand, it needed a fighting force willing to do the fighting. And the more the Americans you meet in this book spend time with Roja, with Azima, with Nowruz, with Mazloum, who is the head of the People's Protection Units, who you'll meet in the book, the more they think these are people who we share values with, who we are aligned with, who are incredible fighters, who will take risks that even we won't take. This was from U.S. forces. And on the other hand, for NATO ally Turkey, the U.S. relationship with these Syrian Kurds becomes an existential threat in its view. And the book really takes you through the why that is. They follow a political leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who was the founder of the PKK, who is in prison in Turkey. And Öcalan has this ideology that says the Kurds cannot be free until women are free. So the women in particular are motivated in their adherence to his writings and to his work. And while he is in prison in prison in Turkey, he starts writing about how the Kurds actually don't need a nation state. They need grassroots participatory democracy, think kind of New England style town hall meetings, without hierarchy and with environmental awareness at its center, and with women playing a central role throughout. And this becomes the political ideology that motivates the women who end up becoming America's partner in the fight against ISIS. And with all that complexity, the Americans are balancing between NATO ally Turkey, who says you cannot work with these people, and U.S. diplomatic and military officials who say, this is the only bet we have. And not only is it the only bet we have, it's a really good one. And it might actually solve most of our problems in terms of countering the Islamic State. And so it is this push me, pull you of U.S. policy that we see.
And tell us about thinking of that, the other forces that came in to support this group of women, because there were fighting forces, certainly from the air, from the U.S., but other on the ground forces that came in to fight along with these women.
Yes. So, and the book talks about this. So it starts with the People's Protection Units, right? That started in the chaos of the Syrian civil war. This group of Kurds who follows Abdullah Öcalan, they take up arms, really thinking they're just protecting their neighborhoods, their towns, right? And there's no thought of ISIS at the time. That really is about just, if you have chaos in your neighborhood, what do? You organize and you figure out how to protect your neighborhood, just like the women in your neighborhoods. Then comes the civil war metastasizing into a multi-pronged battle, and extremism right at the heart, as extremist forces take advantage of the vacuum of the Syrian civil war. And ISIS starts capturing everybody's imagination because it keeps winning towns across Syria, across northern Iraq. It takes the town of Mosul in the summer of 2014, and then it goes on to Kobani after committing true crimes against humanity in Sinjar, which some of you might remember, to the Yazidi community. So this all happens, and then the U.S. is trying to figure out what it's going to do. So the U.S. comes in from the air, but even while it's coming in from the air, Betsy, and supporting these folks, U.S. officials, as you'll see in the book, are saying, look, Kobani is likely to fall. Air power is not enough. What comes enough is this group of Kurds willing to take territory when the airstrikes create openings, plus members of the, as you'll see in the story, Iraqi Peshmerga, the Kurdish Peshmerga, as well as members of the Free Syrian Army, some of whom have fought ISIS in other places. And it's really interesting. My father is from the region, and so being in northern Iraq was really pretty incredible for me. Also, the book actually talks about how the first time I go to Iraq is the first time my family had been back to Iraq since it left 6 decades earlier.
I want to also get into this component of these women and what the young people meant for them. I mean, there are so many scenes that you have in the book about liberating towns, and these women are greeted by young children. Talk to us about some of those scenes, because the way you write about them is incredibly moving.
It is so moving to have seen and to have talked to people, and it is what stayed with them the most.
Yeah.
So there's a moment when Znareen is one of the women we get to meet. Her family says you can't go to university because that's not what girls do. You can't marry the person you love because your uncle has chosen someone for you. And she says, no, I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm never going to get married because I'm not marrying someone you choose for me. And we follow her all the way from that to becoming the driver and the kind of, aide for Nowruz, all the way to her going back to her hometown and freeing it from ISIS. And in a brutal fight where ISIS was taking hostages on the way out, was blowing everything up on the way out, was using snipers to kill civilians on its way out of the town. But then we see girls come up to her and look at her almost like she's from science fiction, which is a very understandable thing, because even in this country, it would look really jarring to see 50, 100, 150 young women with fatigues and braids, and some with, with scarves on their heads and AK-47 slung around their shoulders, trying to take back terrain from the Islamic State and fighting room by room and house by house to do so.
And talk to us about some of the decision making, the tough decisions that these women had to make. Mm-hmm. You have so many harrowing scenes in the book. It's a page turner. Scenes of them, trying to cross the Euphrates River. You have scenes of, Azima being asked by a male under her command. He sees a female ISIS sniper.
Yes.
And he says, I'm not sure, as a man, I cannot target a woman. And she has to say, I am a woman telling you it's okay to kill another woman. It's on me. You can't let her stay there shooting at us. And that's the thing. It's like, so the thing that U.S. Special Operations talked to me about so much was their respect for them as warriors who made tough calls on the side of humanity all the time in truly inhumane situations, right? There's a moment when, this Azima gets a call. And I only smile when I say this because, I flash back to sitting with them and asking them so many questions about this moment and just realizing how much history they have seen and lived, and what a privilege it is to be able to share that with you. So he called her and he said, look, there's this ISIS sniper. She looks like a foreigner. She has long blonde hair and Western kind of jeans kind of things and a light blue shirt. What do we do? Because we're supposed to be protecting women. We can't kill her. And Azima says, look, she's come to kill us. We have to. And if you are worried about that, then it's on my conscience. Okay, you say that I said that you had to do this. And they lived with that. They watched their friends go through truly inhumane things, and yet they worked to retain their own humanity. And yes, there's a moment later when, they are crossing Manbij. And this is a real piece of military history for those of you who are studying the politics of national security. Mm-hmm. The Americans are only in the advise and assist role, and they're watching them cross in very fast, very choppy waters at night, a river that will leave them on the side of ISIS, right? They're going to take a town from ISIS and try to have a surprise crossing. And once they're on the other side, there isn't actually that much the Americans can do for them. They can help them all the way to them, but then they're in ISIS territory and they have to fight their way forward. And the U.S. Special Operations folks are offering them everything. Do you want this life preserver? Do you want this, jacket? Do you want this thing? And these young women who weigh probably less in some cases than the actual life preserver, the U.S. folks are giving them, said, no, I don't want that. I'm here doing work that I believe in, and my fate is going to be my fate. And I'm certainly not going to drown because your thing is so heavy and it takes me underwater. And it really stayed with the Americans, right? That moment of them and the women crossed first into the unknown of ISIS territory that night in the Manbij campaign. I want to talk about the kind of political component of this in terms of women's equality. And so and you allude to this, that it's not just the fighting, it's what comes after that for the equality and the governing of these towns. And so, this is a photo of the Women's Council. Explain to folks what that is and how this has been set up as a result of what these women have been able to do. So every great story starts with the question you can't answer. And the question this book set out to answer is, how in the world did one of the most far-reaching experiments anywhere in women's equality come to take place on the ashes of the fight against the Islamic State?
And part of the answer is that because of their ideology and their political motivation, they had women's equality and emancipation right at the heart of their governance structure. So that in every town, first it's just Kurdish communities, right, that ISIS has not taken over. They have a male head of the town and a female head of the town, and a women's council that is seeking to give more economic, political, and social opportunities to women. Then they start taking towns from ISIS. And in every town they take, there is a man and a woman who co-heads that civil council. Plus, there are women who are forming their own women's councils, women judges who are trying cases that have to do with women and domestic issues. And there are women in political life in numbers that we actually don't see here in the United States. And all of this comes about because in their founding document, which the book really takes you into, women are mentioned 13 times. Women's equality is guaranteed. No child marriage, yes to girls' education, no to dowry, and that every woman has a right to decide her own future is part of this, along with some environmental awareness stipulations and other things. But you see that the women's piece is right at the heart. It is not peripheral to what they're trying to put into place.
And what, these you mentioned sort of attention that is drawn to these women, but it certainly was not something, their story has not been told. If you followed things very, very closely, you may have seen a story or two here or there about them. But by and large, their story was not told. Why do you think that is?
So Betsy, you and I have asked the same question of each other. This is the third time. The first book I had the privilege of writing was The Dressmaker of Karkana, about a teenage.
I'm pulling all these off of my bookshelf, by the way.
Love it. Everyone should have a friend like Betsy.
Just give us a little quick backstory what this is about.
So that's about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban. And all these young women who were breadwinners during years they couldn't be out on their own streets, and who created real hope and real opportunity at times of desperation for women and girls. So that story, I had that question, why has nobody told this before? And people would be, oh, that's such a cute story. And I say, it's not a cute story. It's a story about national security. It's a story about leadership. It's a story about economics. It's a story about entrepreneurship. And then that led to Ashley's War, which was about this all-women special operations team. And that was another where I thought, how in the world has no one told this? And I kept saying to the young women in the story, please don't talk to other people. And as it turned out, I didn't even need to say that because nobody had ever come to ask them their story, even though they had been part of breaking ground in terms of U.S. military history, and then eventually leading to the opening of Army Ranger School in 2015, the opening of all combat roles to women in 2016. And then by the time I got to the Daughters of Kobani, honestly, I was very used to having the privilege of telling the story of women's lives in all their glorious complexity and not having to worry about that many other people thinking it was important. And one thing I will say is we still don't see women's stories as universal. And if this book does its small part to change that, it will have done something.
And tell us just to back to Ashley's War for a second, because that book has also been optioned for a film, and its production is almost ready to start. There's a terrific director who was the director. I don't know if we have any Homeland fans out there, and Reese Witherspoon's production company is producing it. So tell us what you know about when we can expect to see that on film.
So it's moving forward. It's an amazing team. I will say that Universal has been tremendous. They really love the project and love the film. And Leslie Linka Glatter, who directed Homeland, is directing Ashley's War. And I think Homeland, to me, showed the complexity of what we ask of people in these 9/11 wars. And I think that heart, alongside the heroism and alongside the challenge and the complexity and the gray, is something I'm just so excited for people to meet the women who are the story of Ashley's War.
So I want to take a few questions from the audience. This is a question from Isabel, who says, do you think the women in your book will return to the status quo in their return to sort of civilian life? Or do you think their roles within the community will be forever changed by their service? And I mean, you keep in touch with these women. So tell us, get kind of where are they now, and how have they sort of come back to their civilian life?
The ISIS fight is not over, and we actually follow some of the women who liberated towns from ISIS have to go back to those towns to fight Turkish-backed forces during the incursion of October 2019. Only this time there is no U.S. there to help, and so we follow them there. But I will say there is so much hope when you are on the ground in northeastern Syria that it's almost disconcerting, because I think we bring our lens to so much of that. And the truth is, what they've built is unique. It is fragile, it's endangered, but it continues and it endures even to this day. Right? You go to Raqqa, you see tons of women out on the streets in security forces, as teachers, in the Women's Council, in the political buildings. You go to Kobani, and they have kind of a Champs-Elysees where I actually almost bought a pair of pink glittering tennis shoes for my daughter the last time I was there. And what they're building has truly been able to withstand this moment. And I think the big question is, what comes next? What does the Biden administration decide? It has said it was going to keep the pressure on ISIS and stay alongside Iraq. And I think everybody is watching very, very closely.
You write about that at the end of sort of the future there. You say remains a question written in invisible ink, right? That, in a language that no one yet can decipher.
Yeah. Yes. And the one reality that is uncontested is that there is no going back for these women. And in fact, never anywhere in the world have I seen women who are more comfortable with power and less apologetic about right things. And it does feel different when you see that. It really does. And you realize they're not trying to win a million allies. They are trying to lead, and they're trying to govern.
Well, and when you talk about that, though, I mean, you also talked earlier on in the book about one of the women who basically said, we don't want men taking credit for the things that we actually have to do, right?
So Rojda, when I asked her, I said, why did you form the Women's Protection Units in 2014, right? Because they were part of the People's Protection Units. Women had full equality according to their ideology, and already they were fighting alongside men. And she looked at me and she said, first of all, we couldn't let a world stand in which men thought women had no value. Mm-hmm. And secondly, we just didn't want men taking credit for our work. And I thought, that is the most universal sentiment. And that's how you know it's a book, right? That's how you know it's more than a story, is that it's going to reach people in their hearts if you can make it way to readers.
Right. Let's see. Some of the questions that are in here you have already dealt with, but here's one. Let's see. There are these preconceived notions of the West being more progressive, but the U.S. is just barely adjusting to the idea of women serving in combat. Can you talk about how women in your book were able to confront sexism and any gender norms substantially enough to a point where they could fight on the front lines?
So I think there were two things that happened. One is it's an existential risk, right? Yeah. You need every single person. And then I know you've talked about Gina Davis and that whole notion of if you can see it, you can be it.
Right.
Right. So now dads start seeing young women in their families defending their towns, defending their homes from ISIS. And all of a sudden, all these notions that seemed insane or completely mind-boggling before this battle actually come center stage. And I interviewed a dad who I just happened to meet in the town of Kobani near the statue. There's a big statue, which you'll see in the book, that are two women warriors in the middle of the town. And I said, what did you, I said, do you know about the women fighters? And he takes out a picture of his daughter. And he says, yes, and my daughter was injured twice, and I'm so proud of her. And he stopped and he said, I never thought this would be my daughter's life, but I'm so very proud of her. Mm-hmm. And I think that is how you get generational change. Or as Nareen, who goes all the way from not being able to choose who she loves to now her uncle, as you'll see in the book, right now her uncle calls her for advice. And that's because what happened to be true, that the political gains came because they showed their mettle and their valor for their people.
And this was the same uncle who didn't even want her playing soccer as a kid, right?
And in Noreen's case, it was the uncle who said, I have chosen a spouse for you. Women don't get to choose.
Okay.
I've already chosen for you. And now I asked her once, really offhandedly, so do you talk to that uncle and do you talk to the cousin you were supposed to marry? And she said, oh, yes, we're all very good friends now. And he comes to me for advice.
That's amazing.
It really is. I mean, if you think about that, and I think about that, even there's a moment in the book where I talk about my father. So when I was a girl, my father said, quite candidly, like, do you really think men and women are equal?
Yeah.
Because for him, it was a baffling notion in the world in which he was raised.
And so back to sort of the U.S. component, because you talked about the Biden administration, and what's unique is obviously in this Biden administration, we have, folks who were working in the Obama administration that are also in your book, right? I mean, there's times where you talk, for example, about Tony Blinken, who is now the Secretary of State. And these are people who know this region really well. And talk to us about, yes, Brett McCurk, talk to us about what that means about some of these folks coming back into to government and diplomacy and Pentagon.
It's such a fascinating question because nobody in leadership now didn't know this story. Secretary Blinken really lived it when he was advisor to then Vice President Biden and then to President Obama. Brett McGurk, the envoy to the coalition to counter ISIS, lived it and was a huge part. In fact, we go in the book to his first trip, the first official American trip to the region in 2016. It plays out on social media. So all of these people have long known the women and the men who are at the heart of this story. And I think they now walk the same policy tightrope the previous two administrations did, only now they, I think, have a real understanding of what happens when you let the pressure off the Islamic State. And I think, to me, that what should be next is U.S. diplomacy. There is absolutely an opening for a U.S. diplomatic muscle to bring all the parties, including NATO ally Turkey, to the table.
So this is a question about women's leadership roles in the liberated states. Caitlin is asking, can you give us an update about women's leadership roles in the liberated states? So,
and it's interesting because I remember going, even after the Turkish-backed incursion of October 2019, I was in Raqqa and I said, is the Women's Council still exists? And everybody looked at me like I was crazy. Well, of course it does. Well, what about the man and the woman who co-head, Layla Mustafa? And I was, yes, of course, that's all the same. So even in towns that Russia and the Syrian regime nominally oversee, right? And then they took those towns really largely to keep Turkey from in the chaos of October 2019. This is all still going, right? There are women judges who try cases against women. And there's Fauza Youssef, who's in the book. I said to her, didn't you ever hear that all your push to put women at the heart of the compact that governs this sliver of Syria, which is not recognized by anybody politically outside its borders, didn't anybody tell you this is too much, too fast, too much with women's empowerment, too much with women's advancement? And she said, well, of course, of course they did. She said, but you know what? Who cares? She said, we're not interested in people telling us to go slower. We know we won't change thousands of years of history in 7, but we can do our part. And she said, we're working to create a lake in the desert. Yeah. It doesn't happen quickly and it's really difficult, but we have to start somewhere.
And what role do you think sort of social media plays in that? I mean, you do spend some time talking in the book about, the internet and, being able to track movements real time, the influence of Twitter. What are your thoughts on that?
On all sides, social media wants to play a central role in this story. And on the ISIS side, it was a huge recruiting tool, right? They're putting out their slick videos. They're recruiting people from all over. I mean, I've been in Hol Camp in northeastern Syria, which is home to many of the women who became wives and mothers under ISIS, who came from all over the world. I mean, really the United Nations of ISIS. I've interviewed women from British Guiana, from Germany, from Russia, who all came drawn by the notion of ISIS and being part of its project that ISIS launched. Those folks were recruited via Facebook and via Twitter, and they talked to me about it. On the other side, you had the women in this story, Azima, Rojda, Naruz, who really won huge support from around the world because their David versus Goliath stance, with David also as a woman, played out in real time on Facebook, on Twitter, on WhatsApp, across social media platforms. People would see these women going head to head with ISIS, and they would watch on TV. And actually, for the US military folks who are part of this story, they said to me this was the first time their families were following what was happening in real time. Mitch Harper, one of the men in this story, his wife is following the women's protection units on Twitter throughout. And he comes home and she's like, oh, so I saw that, they had a rough day today. And she's like, wait a minute, what do you mean? Then this is new too, right? They've never had it where their families are watching and really rooting for people against ISIS in real time.
And are there other countries or regions in the world? This is another question from Isabel, where civilian women are stepping up, kind of not necessarily to the front lines of combat, but maybe in more diplomatic roles as unelected officials, et cetera, demonstrating sort of the women's leadership component that you talk about in the book.
I mean, women all around the world, in places from Yemen to Syria and across communities, are truly are playing a huge role both in civil society and in the political realm. And 10 years ago, I did a piece about then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her push to put women's equality at the center of women's rights, at the center of the State Department agenda. And every place she would travel, she would meet with women who were leading in their communities. So this is by no means a US thing. And in fact, there is a world in which you'd say the US is not so far ahead when it comes to women in leadership positions. I think women around the country fight each day across the political spectrum for leadership and are leading in their communities, no doubt. But I don't think that we are alone in that.
And tell us about what's next for you, Gayle. What's your next project going to be? Say for like a phone call that doesn't necessarily come your way. I mean, what are you thinking about working on next? I know you're spending a lot of time talking about this book, of course, and you've got the movies. And what else are you thinking about working on?
So first and foremost, when people trust me with their stories, my responsibility is to get them in front of as many people as I possibly can. And I would enlist all of you to help me share this story, because it is a history we should know. And it really is about US national security and about keeping the pressure at the heart of extremism on the Islamic State and groups like it. So that's the first thing I would say. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I had been in the middle of writing a book about the women I grew up with, the community of single moms who raised me in PG County, Maryland, not too far from AU, not very far at all. But a group of women who really, every one of whom was working at least 2 jobs. My mother worked at the phone company during the day and sold Tupperware at night. No one had college degrees. And yet they taught us more than I've learned anywhere else in all of my privilege and studies and Harvard and Fulbright Scholar and all of this. Everything I've had the chance to do is because of them. Mm-hmm. And because of what they sacrificed for me. I know you knew my grandmother. Yeah. I'd like to do justice to their story, but first and foremost, I really want you all to get to know these women and to spend time with them and to see their heart and their humor and their humanity and their courage. I mean,
there's some parts that are funny. There's some parts that you're going to want to cry. And then there's some parts that you just can't wait. And you're kind of turning the page and like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? Right. So congratulations, Gayle. This is just really a perfect book to commemorate Women's History Month, International Women's Day. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this evening. I want to let everybody know, too, that we have some upcoming events. We would love for you to attend. On the 17th, we are going to do, we'll have a new poll that's coming out that the Institute is working with our partners at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation for Gender on the Ballot about women and political participation, and of course the impact of COVID on women. So we'll have a program on that. We'll have registration for that up soon, and then on the 24th. We are going to talk about a new book by Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnes called Lucky, that's just out. You may have heard that in the news recently about the Biden campaign, and we'll talk to them about the women's vote in 2020. So we hope that you will join us for that. But thank you everybody for watching, and thanks again, Gayle. Congratulations on the book, and hope to see everybody soon. Thank you.
So much.
Okay, bye-bye.